Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining our town hall today. My name is Shahad Salnouri, and I'm the co-president of Students for Justice in Palestine at Virginia Tech. We, the collective students for justice in Palestine and the student body in Virginia, have an expressed interest in sharing our own stories of the encampments that took place on our campuses. We have a shared concern on how university administrators and the Commonwealth of Virginia have responded to the encampments. Our voices continue to be diluted by administration, cops, and Zionists, even in spaces like the House and Senate committee meetings that they've held. Because of the continuous attempt to silence our voices, we have decided to host our first town hall in Virginia, hopefully one of many. We aspire to take control of our narrative and paint you the real picture of what happened on our SJPs encampments. Today, we will follow the agenda and allow our speakers to present following a Q&A afterwards. I will go ahead and go first. My name is Shahad Samnouri, as I've just said, and I'm a graduate student at Virginia Tech and the co-president, and I was the co-president of SJP last year as well. I presented this testimony at the House committee meeting, and I have made some minor changes to it. I would like to present it again for the broader public and share it in a place with other testimonies that will be presented today. So here's our story of what happened at Virginia Tech's encampment for Gaza. On the early morning of Friday, April 26, 2024, we formed Gaza's encampment on the Graduate Life Center lawn at Virginia Tech. 4 tents were set up and the clear demands were as such. 1, for Virginia Tech to divest from Israel and provide endowment transparency, which mirrors the call that anti-apartheid activists made for divestment from South Africa in the 1970s. 2, for Virginia Tech to release an official statement condemning Israel's violence. 3, for Virginia Tech to define anti-Palestinian racism and acknowledge the suppression of Palestinian students and their allies, stretching back to when they didn't defend their own Palestinian academic, Stephen Saleta. From 4 to 9 a.m., students, faculty, staff, and community members were gathered up on the lawn, drinking coffee and eating pancakes. At 9 a.m., I was approached by VTPD Chief Macbab. I explained the symbolism behind the tents and how it visually portrays the living conditions of Palestinians on their own land and whose houses have been bombed by the occupation. He informed me that the lawn was precious and the tent stakes were hurting them. I removed the stakes from the ground after that, and he said that the tents are allowed to stay up unstaked. Later that day, he came back and he said the tents must go down. A tactic in an attempt to shut down the encampment and discourage people from staying overnight. He said that, and I quote, "As long as the tents stay down, we are allowed to be there for as long as we want." Again, for as long as we want. At some point during that day, around 1 p.m., I noticed the Dean of Students, Mark Sykes, sitting across the encampment watching with other officers, so I went to talk to him. We sat together as we overlooked the encampment, and I asked him to do me a favor. I asked him to extend an invitation from me to Tim Sands to attend the encampment and listen to his students. Tim Sands rejected that invitation. A member from the encampment attended the faculty senate meeting that day and invited Tim Sands a second time. Tim Sands rejected that invitation. We had a powerful protest that day, and by nighttime, we complied and took the tents down. What Palestinians have taught us over the past 75 years is to always remain resilient, and that is exactly what protesters at the encampment embodied. Everyone there huddled up in blankets and sleeping bags and slept on the lawn through the cold night under the stars. Through its entirety, the encampment was beautiful. You could hear the heartwarming laughter of children playing soccer on the lawn. You could smell the fresh aroma of food the community members continuously brought. You could hear a student playing his guitar on the lawn, and people gathered around him to listen to the soothing tunes. You could see students studying to get ready for finals and passerbys engaging in healthy conversations with attendees, many of them joining in. You could see courageous professors providing educational sessions for students. You could see students gathered up to watch a Palestinian documentary on the lawn. You could see community members constantly donating food, water, blankets, books, banners, flags, supplies, and so much more for the protesters. What people have experienced on the lawn during the encampment was surreal. The picture that is being painted versus the reality are on completely different canvases. Protesters on the encampment could tell you that they have never felt a sense of belonging or safety as they did at the encampment. They never felt this wave of emotions of serenity, happiness, pain, guilt, sadness, freedom, hope, support, and love. One thing they didn't feel was fear, because there is no fear knowing that you are fighting against genocide and injustice. On Sunday, April 26th, the atmosphere radiating from the protesters was peaceful, and that was brutally interrupted by the police. At 2 p.m., MacBab demanded that I have everyone dispersed by 4 p.m., otherwise they will arrest everyone. My question was, what changed between Friday and Sunday? I informed him that no one is leaving until Tim Sands at least shows up to start a discussion. I demanded that when they come back at 4 p.m., that they come back with Tim Sands. At 4 p.m., the police came back with Vice President Student Affairs Francis Keene instead, who had no intention to have a conversation other than to command us to leave the lawn by 6. At 6, we had a protest for Palestine on the lawn. I was called by MacBab while leading the chants and informed that now by 8 p.m. we had to leave. The police initially came with the intention to arrest people, but when they saw just how many students were willing to stay and stand up for Palestine, they were forced to leave and call for backup. From 8 to 10, Muslim students were praying on the lawn in the group, with the beautiful sound of the imam leading the prayer echoing around it. And everyone else had their arms interlocked, circling and protecting the students praying, all aware of the suppression and silencing that is yet to come at any moment. The interruption of such a beautiful scene by the police. After the prayer ended around 10:30, a storm of police officers came on the lawn. Students were divided and barricaded between the lawn and the sidewalk. Once the arrest started, there were about 1,500 students that had shown up to witness the horrific arrests of the peaceful protesters, all chanting things like "Free Palestine" and "Let them go" in a uniformed voice. The police had not anticipated the amount of resilient protesters that were on the lawn. The arrest took place from 10:30 p.m. until 4:30 a.m. 6 whole hours with 2 small vans that take 6 people at a time, drop them off, and come back, many zip-tied for more than 9 hours. Tim Sands ordered the arrests of 82 of his students, faculty, staff, and community members, all because he was uncomfortable with having a conversation with us. The day after the arrests, Hilal at VT invited Attorney General Miyares on campus to celebrate our arrests. 2 days later, I received an email from Tim Sands to meet with him, and he invited 3 Zionists to quote-unquote bridge our gap. We demanded that he create a private meeting for him to meet with his Palestinian students and supporting allies. At the meeting, Tim Sands, the president of Virginia Tech, said, and I quote, "I did not come to the encampment because I was scared of being shouted at." This man, who is, I repeat, the president of this university, is scared of facing his own students. He said during a university council meeting that the protesters were arrested because a group of pro-Israel agitators were coming to the encampment and the university feared a fight. Instead of sending the police after the antagonistic Zionists, they sent the police from 3 different precincts to arrest 82 peaceful protesters. When I noticed even the slightest potential encounter between the protesters and a Zionist agitator, which was only once, I immediately ran to stop it and was thanked by a police officer for always protecting everyone, doing his job for him, basically. The current president of Hillel himself sent me an email to thank me, and I quote, "for protecting the Jewish students in the name of peace during the encampment." If there are divisions on campuses, it is systematically formulated by college administrators across the state due to their lack of knowledge and refusal to obtain insight from the student protesters. The hypocrisy of universities, quote unquote, refusing to take a stance on international conflicts, yet with every single action they take, it is a clear representation and support for Israel and Zionist students. The level of repression seen from administrations in the state and across the nation, from the raiding of students' homes to the lifelong bans of community members from campuses, to the expulsion of students from universities, to the threats of deportation of students, to the firing of staff members, to the blacklisting of professors, to the brutality of the arrests, to the suffering of many constituents has been far too widespread. They have all proved that they are ready to repress against any student that dares to fight against genocide and oppression and have immediately stolen our voices and silenced them. This is evidenced at Virginia Tech by the fallout of the arrests. This past semester, the Student Code of Conduct Office claimed that there would be no limitations on students that were arrested from their sanctions. Yet one of the arrested students was denied the opportunity to even campaign and run for the vice president for shared governance position that I had at the undergraduate student senate. Faculty members that were arrested were threatened for their tenure by their college dean, and staff members' contract was never renewed. Tim Sands to this day believes that the arrestees deserve their trespassing charges. The BOV at Virginia Tech is claiming the administration should target its students further and quote unquote not go so easy on us. And this is what the administration has told us. This university and universities across Virginia have proven that they will do whatever it takes to silence students, faculty, and staff when they speak out against Zionism or protest against it. They say at Virginia Tech, quote unquote, this is home. What home? A home where you are unsafe if you speak against genocide? A home where your complicity in atrocities committed by US imperialism is a requirement to move comfortably within? A home that only accepts Zionists, whether active or passive? Virginia Tech, the universities across this state, the universities across this country are no home. They are arms of the same monster that is carrying out unspeakable crimes against Palestinians right now. We must treat them as such. We must remind them in our words and our actions that the more they try to silence us, the louder we will be. And long live the student intifada. Thank you. I'll go ahead and introduce Sireen Haddad from Virginia Commonwealth University.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be able to share a presentation, right? All right, perfect. All right. So, like Shahad had said, my name is Sadine Haddad, and I'm from Virginia Commonwealth University. And we're here to talk about political repression. We're here to talk about the repression that us as students and Palestinians as well have faced on campus for protesting something that is absolutely unimaginable in the first place. So I just want to start off in the first place and say, why are we protesting, right? One, on the 206th night of the ongoing genocide, we had set up an encampment, but I think that's something that's often overlooked, is why were we protesting in the first place, right? There's been, let me repeat, an ongoing genocide. I personally am from Gaza, and I've had over 180 family members be murdered in this ongoing genocide. And after October 7th, 2023, our president of the university, Michael Rao, had sent out an email addressing October 7th, but calling Palestinians savages and not addressing the broader issue as well, and not acknowledging at all any sort of the Palestinians murdered at all. And us as Palestinians felt discriminated against. We felt no support from our university whatsoever. We had tried protesting. We had consistently got shut down. I had gotten policy violations last year for speaking out at a student walkout that was organized because it was 1 minute past the quote unquote amplified sound barrier allowed. We consistently been discriminated against. And so encampments are, as we all know, historically they are a relevant form of protest. We saw this in many decades prior as well. And this is a public university, so we should have as well rights. And we are in Richmond as well. We have rights as well that we were aware of when we had started this encampment. So at the VCU Gaza Solidarity Encampment, the day had went. Again, this story is nothing unique, right? We see this across a bunch of other campuses. But the day was very peaceful, as you can see from these pictures. There was dancing, there was art. People were bringing in food, bringing in water, and it was just a place that was a liberation zone as well. Even before the tents were set up, and people were calling it the most peaceful and the most welcome that they have felt in so long, considering the fact that VCU and our own university had made us feel so unwelcome, not only as Palestinians, but also as well as people that are pro-Palestinian. And we've been called terrorists before, and at this place, we had felt as though we had a community to be with right now. So we were approached by administration for reminders on policy, which we did comply with, which originally had to do with structures. And there was no police presence until tents ended up being pitched around 5:30 p.m. And our first interaction with police the entire day was buses on riot gear. They had buses with riot gear. And I'm talking dozens of police. This is our first interaction the entire day. We were never warned in any sort of way once the tents went up at all, or the entirety of the day. If we don't take these down, if this, that, then police will respond. Our entire interaction the entire day was them arriving on buses in riot gear. In the VCU demonstration guidelines as well, which are highlighted right here, there have been many, many roles, not only just by VCU PD, but also by the student affairs staff that they did not fulfill. One of them is establishing a point of contact for the organizer and basically explaining the permitted activity by a police officer, monitoring and observing, and also advise on the development of an intervention plan if needed and implement if needed. We were never advised in any sort of way. None of these roles were met. And they're talking about all these students' policy violations. But if you look at the actual websites, which by the way, these were now taken down after the encampment had happened, they did not follow their own guidelines and demonstration guidelines as well. And the police response and the police escalation was absolutely atrocious, like we have heard. Again, like I said, this is nothing unique at all. But this is a rebuttal as well to the Virginia State Police. They had a presentation at the House Senate meeting not too long ago, and they had claimed that increased police force is a form of de-escalation. And this is basically, to be quite honest with you, a myth to justify the intention the police came in, which was to enact violence and to brutalize protesters, regardless of how peaceful we were, because there was absolutely no violence present at the encampment whatsoever. And these are the injuries that I and many of my peers sustained. You can find me pictured on many of these. We have arrests. As you can see, we had absolutely nothing really at all. We weren't, we had nothing really to fend for ourselves in any sort of way besides a singular a piece of wooden cardboard, if anything, between the police, which they immediately kicked down and took it away from us. In the top left picture, you can see me getting pepper spray, which, by the way, had happened in the first 5 seconds of the interaction. They had approached us with this kind of force and violence. Now, I was sent to the hospital that night. I know other peers as well that were sent to the hospital. We were tear gas, pepper sprayed, and we had gone to the hospital. We were informed by the nurses as well that the city had told them to prepare for mass casualties that night as well, which is absolutely horrifying to have had to hear. I suffered head trauma, and my shoulder was completely dislocated by the force that the police used on me while trying to shove me down and pin my arms behind my back. And this is something that I find very important as well. VCU had claimed that they had disrupted the encampment and enacted all of this violence as well because we were being violent, which one is absolutely incorrect. Michael Warehouse sent out an email the following day talking about how it was during final season and the student safety is their number one priority. But in fact, the students were at the encampment. You were not protecting the students in any sort of way whatsoever. The finals were actually being studied for at the encampment. Students had their laptops out. And all of these pictures that you see right here, obviously the top right corner was the post after the encampment as well, during the encampment. This is after they were taking them down and throwing them into garbage trucks. When we had then tried to track down the items the next day, as you can see, these are pictures in the field where they had taken truckloads of students' items, including laptops, and just thrown them into a field and didn't let in any sort of way students try to access it whatsoever, no matter how many people tried. So while they claim to do this to try to get to the safety and for the convenience and for the finals of the students, they themselves actually prevented hundreds of students from completing their finals and had to take later incompletes in their classes. Now, what does this response mean in the end, right? One, there have been multiple repressive policies. There have been surveillance and monitoring. There's been new guidelines that have permitted increased surveillance of student protesters, including monitoring social media activity as well. And this created an atmosphere of fear. There has been the banning of tents and flags and banners, which historically have been used as symbols in protest. And this was a deliberate move to erase the visibility and symbolic power of activism by labeling these items as quote unquote hazards or obstructions. The university has sanitized public spaces meant for expression. There has been new permitting requirements for protests to add. They really quite honestly add a complex layer of bureaucratic approval. And the university administration now wields this kind of power to deny or delay permits based on like subjective criteria, like the appropriateness or the potential impact of protest. And they decide how much police presence there is. When we had tried to have a peaceful art showing during the week of October 7th, the university and administration had come to leaders in SJP and had told us, are you guys going to be violent at this event? This is absolutely directed and targeted when we are students, and it was an art gallery. This is racism. And this, to be quite honest with you, with all of this in mind, with the repressive policies and the monitoring the VCU has intact, this response, quite honestly, means there's just been an infringement of our First Amendment. And across the state, honestly, these all represent this kind of violation of the First Amendment to protest, which should be a fundamental right in this quote unquote, democratic country. Police brutality infringes on these fundamental rights. And this brutality was only possible through repressive policies that targeted pro-Palestinian speech. But this will affect other forms of expression beyond as well. And I will say that this isn't just the pro-Palestinian protest that this affects. Like I had said, this is an attack on all students' freedom of expression. Right here, we have many clubs from VCU and organizations that have put out a statement condemning the university for the attacks that they had done on their own students. And we even have, the Progressive Jewish Student Union have put out a statement as well. And we had many Congress people and many House representatives as well condemn specifically the VCU encampment response as well. I also, as well, really quickly and briefly, would like to talk about how the VCU Division Student of Affairs, who was represented by Dr. Aaron Hart, he continuously cites a protest at the BOV meeting, the Board of Visitors meeting that we had had, that quote unquote complied with policy as proof that these policies aren't actually, repressive in any sort of way, but the students at VCU have successfully, and safely protested underneath these policies and that they're not repressive. But we do reject this praise because it is actually built on our own pain. VCU wants to appear as though it does respect free expression, which actively creates a hostile environment where certain voices are met with force. What his statement did actually fail to recognize that these policies were never actually designed to ensure safety. They were designed to manage and to restrict and to suppress student activism. So by saying that we protest safely under these policies does not acknowledge that it happens in spite of them, not because of them. It erases the emotional toll, the logistical challenges, and the risks that we face when we are trying to exercise our First Amendment rights on campus. And when protests result in hospital visits and criminal charges and endless harassments, there is absolutely nothing safe or successful about it. So are we really, truly even safe in any sort of way when the price of speaking out is administrative punishment and surveillance, and police intervention? We don't need, to be quite honest with you, any sort of applause for our creativity. We need real freedom, and we will not stop demanding it, of course. The policy changes, again, I bring these up as a result not only of the encampment, but of the past year and a half, almost 2 years, really, that students have been continuously protesting on campus, pro-Palestinian protests. These policies and these changes are neither any sort of manifestation of legality, nor is it a compass of morality in any sort of way. When we peacefully gather to exercise our First Amendment rights when expressing international solidarity against a genocide, and the response is characterized by suppression and violence, the university is sending a sort of message that these institutions have aligned themselves with a sentiment of political suppression and state-sanctioned violence. The violence that was sent upon us and hundreds of others in this state, in this country, worldwide, is being framed as a natural consequence to a break in policy. And we have been told that the policy, which is in our student code of conduct, exists to protect the interests of students. But if this is true, how is this policy being able to be weaponized to brutalize us? And how is it possible that the minute that tents went up, the policy was able to justify police escalation? And how is it possible that the policy about structures on our campus space that we actually pay for, by the way, somehow trumped our First Amendment rights to exercise free speech and peaceful assembly? And policy is being used as a tool and as a weapon. I do strongly condemn these new policies, which I honestly will not even get into as well. But there's been campus expression policies we have been having an interim concealment of identity policy requiring anybody to wear a mask, even if it's for sickness and illness reasons, disability reasons, to have a student ID on them at all times in case the police want to question them. We have policies banning chalk because students have peacefully gathered at least once a week last year, writing messages, pro-Palestinian messages continuously. We have, again, I'm going to repeat that. We have had chalk which can be washed off with rain, banned on certain places in our campus. Following the encampment, we really did observe a quite disturbing pattern of quiet, calculated policy changes. We even had the next day as well, we had an encampment on April 29th, which at the time being, again, this is now taken down, but the expected attendance was over 150 people. If it was over 150 people, then it had to be considered a quote unquote major event. Not even the next day, less than 24 hours, VCU tried to act like that it had always been, as you can see on the right that is highlighted, that it was any event more than 50 people. This policy was changed overnight, but they kept the date on the paper that they had handed out as years prior, trying to, in some sort of way, gaslight us into thinking that the policy was always like this. And they never once addressed it as many times that we tried to. And it was a clear attempt to stifle mass mobilization and protest. And the restriction was framed as a safety measure, yet it disproportionately targeted student-led demonstrations advocating for Palestinian rights, while other campus events of similar or larger size faced absolutely no scrutiny. These policies are not black and white in any sort of way. So how will we create any sort of safe spaces for protests with shifting political landscapes and global crises, right? The university is meant to be a space to think critically about these matters in and outside of the classroom. By targeting pro-Palestinian protests through racism, with violence and terror, and inventing these new expression policies to silence this particular movement as well, our public universities are effectively setting the scene for a new age of protest, one that is actually dictated by policy violations after violation with militarized state responses. These policy changes reflect a broader trend of eroding civil liberties on college campuses, and they set a dangerous precedent where universities can enforce repressive measures under the pretext of policy compliance while avoiding public accountability. An excessive use of force or mass arrest or surveillance or intimidation or censorship in any sort of way is absolutely atrocious. This is what the policies do set the stage for, and these kind of regimes don't formulate overnight, as they tried to claim. They are slowly built, and these policies are a one-of-a-kind tool and a key tool that universities use to try to suppress us. So I'm coming on to the end here, but looking forward, when our right to protest, which should be a fundamental right of the First Amendment, is met with violence and repression and policy manipulation, we must ask ourselves, what does the future of advocacy actually hold in this country? We weren't protesting for something controversial or absolutely atrocious or absurd. We were protesting a human rights atrocity. I have lost, like I said, over 170 family members in this ongoing genocide, and my 14-year-old cousin was bombed a couple weeks ago while trying to get bread. 11 other of my cousins were killed while sleeping in their own home. And this isn't just personal. It's like I said, a global human rights crisis. And yet when we raise our voices in peaceful protests, no matter what sort of form it is. As you can see, the chalking at the bottom, we have protests on the right. We interrupted the city council with, stained our hands red. Up there, we put our hands in red paint, while the president of our university, Michael Rao, was giving the State of University address where he had, in any sort of way, he had failed to acknowledge Palestinian students, the pro-Palestinian movement in every sort of way, and tried to claim that VCU was actually now ranked 35 in the country for free speech, by the way, in that same speech, which was an absolute joke. We ask for basic human dignity through our protests and for our university to stop using our tuition dollars in support of companies complicit in the destruction of our families and our people. But the response we receive sends a chilling message that speaking out for human rights is dangerous, and demanding justice for the oppressed is a punishable offense. And if we cannot advocate for the most basic human right, the right to live, without being met with violence and repression, what rights are really left for us to defend? And the cost of this silence, if the suppression continues, what will really future advocacy hold in any sort of way? We cannot allow these universities to become training grounds in any sort of way. We must recognize that these fights truly do extend far beyond Palestinian advocacy. These policies that are used to suppress us today will be used against others tomorrow. And the precedent being set endangers all forms of activism and all future advocates. We are standing at dangerous crossroads. Will the university remain spaces of intellectual freedom like they claim, or will they become places where only state-approved narratives are allowed? And will advocacy be protected, or will it be punished? As a Palestinian at VCU, I have faced relentless discrimination. I'm putting it back to this slide just so while I talk about this. These are my family members that have been murdered in the ongoing genocide, including a 20-day-old baby at the bottom. I have faced relentless discrimination, harassment, intimidation, both on and off campus. This isn't about isolated incidents. It's about a hostile culture that VCU has allowed to foster by failing to support Palestinian students and by continuously painting our existence as a threat and our advocacy as inherently threatening. I've been spit on while walking through campus. I've had handgun gestures pointed at me, a cruel mockery of the very violence that Palestinians endure daily. I've received hateful messages and threats targeting me, and they're not just random acts, they're the direct result of how Palestinians have been framed by the university's administration. The dangers we face on campus are not because of our Jewish allies, with whom we stand in solidarity, and they stand in solidarity with us. It comes from the Zionists who justify the murder of our people and weaponize accusations of anti-Semitism, making their feelings of quote-unquote unsafety valued, while Palestinians' physical unsafety from the state and from the university and other community members is entirely neglected because we speak out against genocide, God forbid. And the irony is that Palestinians in these protests are not anti-Semitic. We are actually just anti-Zionist. We oppose a violent ideology that has been displaced and killed, countless Palestinians, including my own family members. So time and time again, VCU has blurred this distinction. How can I, as a Palestinian student, feel safe on a campus that views my identity as a political liability? And how can I trust a university that brutalized me for standing up for my own family and my own people? So, what does this mean as a Palestinian organizer? Protesting has never been a choice for me. It's been a necessity. And as a Palestinian, my family's lives were stolen. I cannot bring them back. I can, however, fight to ensure that their stories are never erased, and speaking out has become my form of advocacy in preserving their memory. But what does a university expect a student to do when faced with the brutal reality of having family members murdered in an ongoing genocide, one that the university itself helps fund through its own financial ties? A university is supposed to be a place of support and a place that nurtures critical thinking. Yet in this instance, VCU not only denies its complicity against Palestinians, but also actively punishes those who dare to speak the truth about it. The hypocrisy is absolutely staggering. An institution that claims to uphold the values of education and student welfare is instead silencing the very voices that need to be amplified. They are punishing dissent, particularly when it arises from such deeply personal and tragic circumstances, and it does not reflect any sort of commitment to learning or justice. It instead exposes a profound lack of moral integrity. The approach is not only harmful to those directly affected, but it also erodes the ethical foundation upon which any academic institution should be built on. Organizing at VCU has never felt like exercising any sort of constitutional right. It has felt like a battle for survival. Every action comes with the knowledge that my peers and I face, and that we might face police violence in every sort of action that we try to commit, even chalking, honestly, and this isn't what democracy or free speech looks like. Palestinian students and organizers are not just fighting for justice abroad. We're fighting for our right to exist safely on our campus. And we're treated as if we are the problems to be managed rather than as students deserving of protection and respect. This is more than a failure of policy, it's a failure of humanity. So, in conclusion, VCU has made it abundantly clear that Palestinian lives, stories, and struggles and inconvenient truths, are inconvenient truths that they would rather erase, that they would rather send police on than confront. But our existence really, truly is not up for any sort of debate, and neither is our right to speak out. I refuse to be silenced by a university. Everyone in this meeting refuses to be silenced by a university that would rather protect its public image than protect its students. I refuse to let discrimination go unchecked because a policy is designed to suppress and to isolate us. It is absolutely unfathomable that I have to continue having these sort of meetings and standing here convincing people that we should be allowed to protest the murder of my family and my people and not be repressed in doing so. I will still do so, of course. And we will continue to resist and not be, repressed, and we will not give into it because that is what we have to do. But Palestinian students and pro-Palestinian students, we deserve better. We deserve a campus where our lives and our advocacy are valued and not criminalized. And we demand that VCU and the public universities across the state, private universities across the country in general, acknowledge the harm that they have caused and take real steps towards ensuring a safer environment for all students, all administration, especially those who are marginalized by its current policies and practices. So to finish off, I am standing here to make sure that my voice is heard, that every single person's voice here is heard, and the voices of students who have been silenced by repressive policies, the voices of Palestinians who have been continuously attacked, whether they are living or whether they have been murdered, are fought in this kind of justice. And VCU's actions have made it absolutely clear they are more committed to silencing dissent than protecting the students that they claim to serve. And we have taken action, we have protested, and we have demanded justice. But where has the university's response been? Where is the protection for Palestinian students facing harassment and retaliation? The truth is absolutely undeniable, and the consequences of inaction are irreversible. We stand at a crossroads, like I had said previously. One path leads to accountability and justice, and the other leads to complicity and silence. Palestinian students deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, Sidine, for sharing such a powerful speech and shedding light on what has been going on at VCU. We'll go ahead and go to our next speakers, which are going to present a solidarity statement from William and Mary, and they're Salma Amru and Iqra Ahmed.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ikra, and I'm the co-president of SJP at William & Mary. I'm with Salma, who is my other co-president. We'd like to highlight a core theme underlining some of the points our colleagues earlier brought up: institutional rhetoric on violence. Since last October, school admin, local law enforcement, and a lot of media publications have consistently attached descriptors of aggression and violence to most, if not all, SJP actions, whether it's at the chapter level, the state level, or the national level, and have issued warnings accordingly. In particular, was VCU's warning of a violent protest when they began their encampments last spring. In reality, SJP leaders are specifically trained to, and in turn train their members to, avoid sparking and engaging in conflict with counter-protesters and with outside agitators. The real violence in question, as we have seen over the past year, is how administration handles these protests, which themselves are nonviolent. This entails VCU sending in over 100 Richmond and Virginia State police officers in riot gear and with chemical sprays to deploy against students who have nothing defending themselves and have been gathering nonviolently. It is Virginia Tech's president ordering police officers from multiple local precincts to arrest over 80 nonviolent student and faculty protesters who have been doing nothing in the middle of the night. Not only is that label of violent overwhelmingly on evidence, as our colleagues pointed out earlier, it also plays on inherently racial tropes. It is not difficult to look at an SJP and recognize that it is an organization comprising predominantly minority students, Arab students, South Asian students, Muslim students, and other students of color, other students of marginalized backgrounds, demographics against whom historically the label of violence has been weaponized to justify oppressing, brutalizing, and criminalizing them to an unjustifiable level. To say that SJPs are violent in rhetoric or ideology or practice is blatantly false, but perceived as true because it draws from and reinforces the outsider's conception of how a minority majority group may behave. And this stands in complete contrast to each of our institutions' alleged values on fostering belonging and community. To say that SJPs are violent is to be, yes, blatantly racist.
Although we at William and Mary were unable to organize our own encampments last spring and have not personally gone through the same level of repression that our colleagues here have, we are governed by the same state systems and institutions which both enabled and enacted the brutality that we witnessed at the encampments, both in and out of state early last year. The struggle of our fellow students is our struggle, and we stand in solidarity with all who have faced repression simply for enacting their First Amendment rights and standing up for justice and humanity. As students, we call out the inconsistency and the hypocrisy of our institutions and their administrations in claiming to hold space for diverse thoughts, perspectives, and identities, while also repressing the expression of the same diverse thoughts, perspectives, and identities that do not serve their own limited perspectives or their personal and occupational gains. Students of Arab and Muslim background who are bearing witness to the active daily slaughter of their brothers and sisters across the world deserve the same rights and privileges in expressing their perspectives as a student of any other background. And it goes without saying that they should not be criminalized and demonized for holding their institutions accountable in their complicity in the genocide. As students, our conviction in holding our institutions accountable does not arise from a desire to antagonize our institutions or wreak havoc as they may like to portray it as, but from a genuine desire to see our institutions, as well as our presence and participation in them, to be a force of positive change in the world. Israel has demolished all 12 institutions of higher learning in Gaza and has actively targeted educators and intellectuals in an avid and deliberate campaign of scholasticide. We, as Arab and Muslim students witnessing these atrocities, cannot, in good conscience, go about our lives as students in the Imperial Corps without actively acknowledging and fighting against the fact that the blood of our fellow students across the world also smears the hands of our institutions. The only characteristic that separates us from them is an accident of birth, and they are no less deserving of a right to life, dignity, and education than we are.
Each of our universities touts a core value of theirs to be embracing diversity in people, in cultures, perspectives, and in education as a core value. And rightfully so. We should strive to act with that open-mindedness and understanding. But the past year has demonstrated time and time again that our institutions have a very long way to go in achieving that. When VCU, VTech, and GMU deploy institutional violence against their nonviolent students of very specific backgrounds as a means of silencing them and overwriting their stories and their histories without taking a moment to understanding why they're going through with what they are, their actions very much do not align with the words of their values. When, like VCU, William and Mary also silently changes its use of campus facilities policies to hinder specific political activities, such as by prohibiting camping on school grounds, but takes no issues with other recognized student organizations, say inviting and hosting a member of the Proud Boys who's been convicted for assaulting law enforcement, their actions once again fail to align with the words of their values. Our schools will put more security resources into surveilling and intimidating students whose violence begins and ends with calling for the liberation of Palestine from a brutal 76-year apartheid and occupation than they do in protecting us from convicted felons with established legal records of actual violence, substanding and walking and interacting with students on our campuses. I received the attention of 6 police officers when I defined the word intifada through a microphone outside, and the on-campus presence of someone with a history of real violence and affiliation to a known white nationalist group receives nowhere near as much energy. With this in mind, I do have to ask my school, I do have to ask my state, what could we possibly be basing our definitions of violence on? Because as we have demonstrated multiple times, not just today, not just over the past few weeks, not just with our words, but over with all our actions over the past year and a half now, it isn't the sentiments with which we operate or the acts in which we engage that define violence to you.
And to be very clear, all of the actions that any of our SJP chapters have engaged in and will continue to engage in are for the same purpose, disclosure and divestment. We want our institutions to be transparent with where their financial assets lie, whether it be through the boards of visitors, third-party investment funds like William and Mary 1693 Foundation, or something else entirely. We want our institutions to publicly make this information available, and based off of it, we want our institutions to remove their financial assets from corporations that are known to be complicit in Israel's war crimes against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. We act to hold our institutions accountable to their own teachings. When William and Mary says it is honorable, equitable, trustworthy, and committed to the highest ethical standards in all that they do, we want to see that. If and when there is a shortcoming to those ethical standards, our institution and its actors should strive to improve, not conceal. To put it very simply, we want to attend institutions that truly embody the values that they claim to uphold. We want to learn at institutions that have learned their own lessons from history. Learning is a two-way street, and it cannot effectively happen without both the educator and the educated being open and genuine in their efforts and willing to learn from each other. We speak for both ourselves and all students here when we say that this past year has consisted of us talking to the proverbial brick wall and a series of repeated and unfortunate realizations that we have to handhold our institutions through understanding the most basic of morals, ethics, and expressions of humanity. Concepts that should be intrinsic and intuitive to our existence as humans, no matter our background or the positions that we occupy. It is shameful that those with access to the highest and most esteemed educations, institutions, and intellectual spaces that the world has to offer actively maintain their willful ignorance and blindness to realities and stances which are intuitive to even a child with the most basic moral sense and justice. All that to say, long live the student intifada and free Palestine from the river to the sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Salma and Iqra. That was really wonderful. Next, we have William Patrick Keene, and he's going to be talking about George Mason's retaliation.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Y'all can call me Liam Keene, or just Liam. But I am a senior at George Mason University, and I'm here to speak about the recent actions against both members of Students for Justice in Palestine at George Mason University and its members. And I want to also discuss my internal processing of such events. So before I start, I would like to thank everyone for choosing to spend their morning here. As many of you know better than I can even comprehend, we live in a very dark age, an age with the shroud of optimistic misguidance as well. And what I mean by that is we're promised something in the future towards progress, and we continue to think that we have progress, but we continue to be trapped in the same old battles. For many college students right now, our childhoods have been filled with moments of hope for a better future, moments where we think we made progress only to realize that we find ourselves fighting the same old battles. The 20th century has been labeled by many as the century of the fight for civil rights. Labels bring with them unmatched strength, and we must define our battle not as one for the rights afforded by the state, but simply a struggle for human dignity. We do not intend to beg for rights to be afforded when we don't just believe, but we know that these rights should be inherent, regardless of ruling body. We don't just fight for a just town, a just state, or a just country. We fight for a just world. No leader in this country or outside of it has merely ever fought for civil rights. The fight has always been for human dignity. This has been the goal since the first instance in which human dignity was impeded. It is essential to remind ourselves of such. We must call back to this battle that has been waged since the dawn of mankind. Those who impede upon human dignity versus those who are fighting for something much larger than themselves. When people ask us which side we are on, we do not jump to state a specific cause or campaign being waged against injustice, but rather we simply state we are fighting on the side of human dignity, the same battle that has defined human history. As we enter a new year, we enter a period ripe for reflection. This past year carries many lessons that we must bring forward into 2025. In 2024, as we reflect on the experiences of Arab and Muslim students at George Mason University, we see an increase in prejudice and dehumanizing views and actions towards these populations. At Mason, we still see insufficient religious prayer spaces for Muslim students, and we've seen a particular set of behaviors emboldened, behaviors that must be called out and addressed. Consider the Heritage Foundation's release of Project Esther. On the surface, it carries good intentions about ridding university and college campuses of anti-Semitism. But if you read the first line on their website, it becomes clear that this project isn't about combating anti-Semitism at all. Instead, it's a direct attack on the so-called anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-American pro-Palestinian movement, painting organizations such as Students for Justice in Palestine as terrorist organizations. Let's be real. This is nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to silence dissent. The political system weaponizes identities um, and finds ways to use them to distract the public from systemic issues and redirect conversations away from what people truly need. Labeling SJPs as terrorist organizations is not only disingenuous, it's dangerous. The word terrorist has always been politically defined, historically used as a tool to marginalize anyone who doesn't fit into the mold of whiteness or the status quo. It is a word wielded to justify violence, surveillance, and repression against communities of colors, immigrants, and activists. The misuse of language emboldens other harmful actions, creating a culture where Arab and Muslim students are treated as perpetual suspects simply for existing or speaking out. At Mason, this rhetoric has already had chilling consequences. Police racially profiled a visibly Arab man as a suspect after a banner was hung protesting the genocide in Gaza, a protest he had no involvement in. The presence of a Muslim organization similarly uninvolved was also interrogated by authorities. And let's not forget the large-scale raid of the off-campus residence of two students, another blatant example of overreach and intimidation. To my knowledge, no warrant was ever presented during the raid. These two members of Mason's SJP were never detained, yet they were forced to remain confined to their living room while armed law enforcement conducted a search of their residence. These are the facts, and there has been little to no transparency from the authorities regarding this matter. These actions culminated in George Mason University's um, SJP being removed from campus altogether, effectively silencing a group that dared to challenge the status quo. Adding to this issue is the fact that many of GMU's Board of Visitors are affiliated with the Heritage Foundation, an organization that openly supports Project Esther and founded it. This raises serious questions about the influence of such connections on decisions that have directly impacted the campus community. If you had your finger on much of the pulse of the Jewish students before October 7th, 2023, you wouldn't have heard about fears of SJPs, but rather you would have heard fears about rising threats of white nationalism and neo-Nazism. Um, what did proponents of Project Esther do to address those threats then? What has any politician done to confront anti-Semitism when it doesn't serve their political interests? I've spoken with members of synagogues targeted by white supremacists, and the government's response has consistently fallen short. Yet when it's politically convenient, it seems the Jewish identity is weaponized to justify oppressive actions. That is, by definition, anti-Semitic. It is painfully ignorant and insulting to ignore a community's pain when it's inconvenient and then claim to champion it when it suits your agenda. The weaponization of media, armed enforcement, and power structures against those advocating for justice is not new. No actions we see today should surprise us if we examine the historical record. Looking back, history is littered with examples of how governments and institutions have used their power to suppress movements challenging the status quo. These tactics are not anomalies, but deliberate, calculated, and cyclical. Consider Fred Hampton, the young leader of the Black Panther Party, whose life was cut violently short by an FBI coordinated raid. Hampton wasn't just a political threat because of his rhetoric or his critique of systemic oppression. He was a threat because of his ability to unite people across racial and economic divides. The U.S. government, instead of addressing the systemic racism and economic inequality Hampton sought to challenge, chose instead to silence him. Dr. King, revered today as a symbol of justice and peace, was similarly vilified during his time. He was surveilled, harassed, and labeled a radical for daring to demand civil rights and speak out against systemic racism, poverty, and the Vietnam War. He was not assassinated simply for dreaming of a better future, but he was assassinated for exposing the hypocrisies of a government that claimed to stand for freedom and justice while perpetuating oppression at home and abroad. These same tactics, the weaponization of identity and the deliberate pitting of individuals and communities against each other, remain firmly entrenched in the playbook of those in power. Rather than addressing international genocide, the systemic racism embedded in the United States, or the daily struggle of marginalized communities, the system creates distractions. It shifts focus from the real issues to debates around identity, casting advocates for justice as threats and radicals. What we are seeing today, the raids, the surveillance, the profiling, the removal of dissenting voices, it is not new. It is a part of a historical pattern where power structures resist change by silencing those who demand it. But history also teaches us that understanding these patterns can guide our actions. If we contextualize today's struggles through the lens of the past, we gain clarity and resilience. We see that the resistance we face is not personal but systemic, making our fight all the more necessary. Fred Hampton's work did not die with him. Dr. King's legacy lives on not because of those who sought to silence him, but because people continued his fight. Understanding the past as a guide empowers us to remain steadfast in addressing systemic oppression and building a better future. As we look ahead, let us ground ourselves in three core pillars: the past, human dignity, and love. By understanding the past, we can unmask the patterns of systemic oppression that continue to hinder progress. By committing to human dignity, we ensure that every action we take uplifts those around us, affirming the inherent worth of every individual. And by centering our work in love, not the romantic kind, but the kind that seeks the best for others, even when it requires us to set aside our egos, we create the foundation for a better world. Love in its truest form asks us to wish even our so-called enemies well, not because we condone their actions, but because love is the antidote to stagnation. Anger and frustration, while justified, cannot sustain us, and if we rely solely on these emotions as fuel, we risk becoming trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle of resentment and retribution. Progress demands more from us. It requires that we rise above anger to reclaim our humanity, to act not out of spite, but out of a vision for a world better than the one we inherited. I envision a world where being heard is not a battle, but an inherent right. It is a world where we don't view disagreement as a threat, but as an opportunity for understanding. And above all, it is a world where we don't waste energy arguing over problems, but instead focusing on our collective will for solutions. No human being suffers unnecessarily, or in this world, no human being suffers unnecessarily. And progress is defined by the well-being of all, not the privilege of a few. Let us leave here today with a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to carrying these values forward. May we remember the lessons of the past, hold fast to the principles of dignity, and always lead with love. Only then can we break free from cycles of oppression and build the just and equitable future that all people deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liam. That was really wonderful. Next, we have Eli to speak on the weaponization of anti-Semitism.
Thank you. As people across the country and across the world watch in horror as the United States funds and facilitates the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people, the inhumanity of the crimes perpetrated against the Palestinians are too clear to defend. So instead of arguing the unjustifiable, supporters of this genocide have instead attempted to violently suppress dissent by labeling any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, dangerous, and violent. This is all done, supposedly, to support the safety of the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is real, and like any form of bigotry, it has no place in movements which work towards the goal of collective liberation. However, the movement for Palestinian liberation is not anti-Semitic. We are anti-Zionist, and there's a difference. And the conflation of the two, much like Zionism itself, further endangers Jewish people and fails miserably to accomplish Zionism's stated goal, securing Jewish safety. The search for safety from persecution is hundreds of years old for the Jewish people, who have long endured violent discrimination, deportations, and mass slaughter on account of our identity. Through these traumas, Jewish culture grew to place increased importance on solidarity and collective liberation, albeit not in those terms. Like many Jewish Europeans forced to endure an onslaught of anti-Semitism during the first half of the 20th century, a man by the name of Hans Kohn moved from Europe to Palestine as a firm believer in the Zionist project and one of the directors of Keren Hayseed, the Palestinian Foundation Fund, the financial arm of the World Zionist Organization. Like many young Jewish people today, Kohn learned about Zionism as a possible and even ideal solution to the age-old uncertainty of the Jewish people. Kohn wrote that he initially, quote, regarded Zionism as a moral, spiritual movement within which we could realize our most fundamental humane convictions, our pacifism, our liberalism, and our humanism. In a 1929 letter to his colleagues, Kohn continued that, quote, as a Jew and as a human being, as a Jewish human being, two qualities which in me are inseparable and parallel. I am a pacifist, an anti-imperialist, and in America, what is called a radical. Jewish anti-Zionism is not new. Like Kohn, many of us were taught to believe in the idea of a Jewish state without acknowledging the reality of what Zionism actually is and the moral atrocities it demands of us. Every Saturday morning at synagogue, I remember repeating the rabbi's words as he spoke from the bima, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." We grew up learning not only of the biblical persecution of the Jewish people, but also directly from Holocaust survivors who told us their stories. As we listened to the horrific tragedies they endured, one message was hammered home: never again. As we racked our brains to understand how such a thing could happen, how such a genocide could be allowed to occur, we found our answers in the words of survivors. What hurts the victim most is not the violence of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander, wrote Elie Wiesel. Using the principles we learned in Jewish day schools, Jewish college students across the country have stood in solidarity with the Palestinian people, declaring that never again must mean never again for anyone. Chants which call for freedom for Palestinians are not anti-Semitic calls for violence. This is only true if you believe Palestinians are inherently dangerous and anti-Semitic. This is a racist lie meant to divide us and perpetuate injustice. Our freedom and our safety is intertwined. In speaking and working with activists, organizers, and fellow students, I've never once encountered anti-Semitism from within the movement for Palestinian liberation. What I have seen is peaceful protesters assaulted and beaten by our state police at the invitation of our universities. What I have seen is right-wing anti-Semitic organizations support the Zionist project because they seek to get Jews out of the United States. What I have seen is my identity used as a cudgel with which to wield against those brave few who have been willing to speak out against injustice. When I was 7 or 8, I first read Martin Niemöller's famous poem in my history class. Parts of that poem read, quote, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak up because I was not a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak up because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and by that time there was no one left to speak up for me." Students across the Commonwealth have attempted to speak up, and they have been met with violent repression from their government and from their universities. I encourage legislators and all those who seek to preserve the rights granted to us by the Constitution of the United States to ask our universities and our law enforcement officials who or what was being protected when state police violently assaulted students engaged in nonviolent protest. It wasn't Jewish students, many of whom were themselves assaulted. It was not faculty, who overwhelmingly support their students' right to organize. And it was not the public, who often saw significant disruptions to their daily lives as a result of police conduct. State police were sent to Virginia universities to protect their reputation and endowments from criticism, not to protect the universities from real damage or unsafe behavior or threats of violence, but to protect them from criticism. When institutions cynically use the threat of anti-Semitism to silence anti-war advocates, we are all made less safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eli, for that powerful insight on anti-Semitism. And next, we have Mamadou Tall to speak on the current nationwide retaliation.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'll just go straight into it. I was recently at the center of an international media storm. Cornell University was prepared to be among the first in the United States to deport an international student over pro-Palestinian advocacy. My crime, remaining a vocal and ardent critic of Zionism and the State of Israel. My continued involvement in protests on campus placed a target on my back. My case garnered international coverage as thousands globally signed a petition demanding the university reverse its decision. If you were to ask the administration, they would claim we don't have the power to deport. However, I ask here what I asked them at the time. What is the word for telling someone that they will no longer be allowed to remain in the country, even though I have no desire to leave right now? On the 23rd of September, I walked toward the university's official administrative building. I had been summoned to meet the university administration after attending an action that brought to standstill a career fair. A careers fair that featured arms companies supplying Israel, including Boeing and L3 Harris. The university had made the decision to crush pro-Palestinian protests, and I wanted to make an example out of me. As I made my way, I went past the historical site of Black Power student activism, which led to the founding of the first Department of Africana Studies in the United States, challenging the foundations of a university founded on indigenous genocide. If those sites could talk, I suspect they would speak of a collectivist spirit, the kind of spirit that has historically pushed for a more just world. I was reminded of the hopes and dreams of those who believed in the transformative power of education. We have come a long way since those days, I told myself. Despite presenting myself in person, I was told that the administrator would be absent and instead join remotely via Zoom. This was the first step in a cold and cynical process. She appeared over a large widescreen TV and read a list of supposed violations of Student Code of Conduct. After the charges were read, she pronounced the judgment without giving me a chance to respond to the allegations. I was set to be de-enrolled from the university, after which I would be given 48 hours to pack my bags and await deportation. In subsequent meetings, I was labeled a public health and safety concern and banned from campus. I could not teach. I was not permitted to use the Muslim prayer facilities. I was even asked to give intimate details of any condition before being granted to use the health center. Despite there being no evidence of violence on my part, the administration seemed to determine me as a threat. I found it increasingly hard to recognize Cornell as a serious academic institution. On one level, the university's posture suggested that prioritizing the financial interests of corporations, including weapons manufacturers, outweighed the moral right to protest what is a genocide. On another level, Administrators clinically dished out disproportionate punishments in scenes reminiscent of Arendt's The Banality of Evil. The university could care less if the cause was just, as long as they ensure their reputational standing and maintain its own internal power structures. It preferred to comply with the status quo and to suppress dissent under the guise of maintaining law and order. I was reminded of the university's Office Student Code of Conduct, which reads, quite ironically, Cornell student, and I quote, Cornell student conduct process focuses on principles of reflection and learning. The process incorporates restorative practices to build a culture of community and healing, rather than a community that centers around judgment and punishment. Our goal is to support you in navigating situations that might not meet our community's expectations. We believe students should not be defined by their mistakes, but rather by their willingness to learn. End quote. They claim to foster community built on restorative practices and not punishment. Yet, when I was told I would face deportation, it was difficult for me to see it was difficult not to see the absurdity of this claim. The language of restorative practice was co-opted and weaponized to present an image of compassion when in effect entrenching an oppressive and completely punitive system, privileging power over principle. Under mounting pressure from political forces, universities have become targets for crackdowns on pro-Palestinian speech. We witnessed one university president after another subjected to hearings and investigations, in which the message was clear that support for Palestinian advocacy could no longer be tolerated. This signaled a shift in the role of higher education institutions, where they no longer viewed as spaces for intellectual inquiry and critical thought, but rather as entities that must align with state-sponsored agendas. Universities became conscripted into a new kind of war. Students are now being asked to serve the state bureaucracy rather than critically engage. This does not reflect every individual at these institutions, but rather the board of trustees and the leadership that sets the agenda, with the university uncritically abiding. We must learn two critical lessons from these events. First, that even those who capitulate to the pressures of Zionism will not be spared. And second, we must reconsider the kind of institutions we want our universities to be. Zionism demands nothing less than the excusal of Israeli terror. For all the talks about past protests, whether against the Vietnam War or South African apartheid, the current stance of the university shows that these institutions are more likely to align with the state's interests when the issue at hand challenges the very foundations of that power. The university may publicly celebrate its historical stances, but when it comes to Palestine, it has shown cowardice. The institution's complicity in the ongoing genocide against the Palestinians will be a part of this country's and its institution's legacies. This selective engagement with history is a tactic to mask present-day complicity. It begs the question, what is it about the disruption of a recruitment fair that warrants a response as extreme as deportation? To date, many students involved in similar protests have faced severe consequences for their activism. But these responses only begin to make sense when we center the Palestinian cause. The fact is that many of our institutions are complicit in the ongoing genocide against Palestinians. Calls for divestment and solidarity are not just demands for financial change, but a moral reclamation of humanity itself. Palestine is the issue of our time. It holds up a mirror to our society, forcing us to consider what kind of world we want to live in. As Frantz Fanon teaches us, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Can we continue to live in a world where our educational institutions abandon intellectual integrity and instead uphold complicity? Why do self-professed liberal institutions so often opt for complicity over justice? As Israel's genocidal assault on Palestinians rages on, universities across the world have shown that rather than being sanctuaries for righteous indignation, they have become sites for repression. As the semester of 2024 approached, university administrators and law enforcement agencies worked together to find new ways to suppress student activism. Campuses are hostile environments, with faculty losing their jobs and administrators coordinating their efforts to stifle dissent. The repression on campuses isn't just about shutting down pro-Palestinian voices. It is a part of a broader crisis of legitimacy faced by these institutions. When students are confronted with moral crossroads and the university sides with oppressors, their legitimacy falters. The university, if it continues to align with Zionism and the genocide it justifies, will continue to suffer. As we witness the forced resignation of university presidents, the denial of tenure to scholars, and the firing of faculty, it becomes clear if we do not reflect on the current state of the university, then our positions within these institutions are meaningless. My story is not an anomaly. As I said earlier, universities have coordinated with law enforcement to suppress pro-Palestinian speech. It is as if the camera of truth is inverted because no one is being punished for being pro-Israeli, no one is being suspended for being pro-Zionism, and no one is being denied tenure for being pro-genocide. However, it is on brand for the United States. The United States is no stranger to genocide. The genocidal foundations of this country attest to that. The US awards arms, finances genocides. Like Zionism, it has an insatiable bloodlust. It is with a huge sense of shame that I write these words. Never would I have imagined that the live streaming of a genocide, accompanied by the necessity of new vocabulary to describe what we have witnessed, would continue for this long. I find some solace in knowing that we can never go back. More and more have been awoken to the true nature of Zionism. Zionism has been revealed for what it is, a brutal settler colonial ideology. However, far too many choose to ignore or opt for cowardice over courage. James Baldwin's fear of a moral apathy is made apparent in this time. Imperialism's contempt for humanity serves as a reminder of the brutality with which this system continues. It is within this inhumane and dehumanizing system that the struggle to keep our hearts alive rests on the valiant Palestinian resistance. We owe Palestinians a debt, for if it is defaulted on, I fear that our humanity may not return. Inspired by Kwame Ture, I also have two dreams: a unified Africa and praying Salah in a liberated Aqsa. Free Palestine.
That was a really powerful speech. Thank you so much, Mamadou. Next, we have Dr. Brandy Faulkner to talk on the history of police brutality and nationwide repression.
Hello, everybody. Hope everybody is happy and healthy and safe. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts about policing, specifically in the United States and its role in suppression, especially social movements for racial justice. So let's begin with a very important premise. State violence coerces silence. It really is that simple because policing is innately a violent process. It requires a group of people to swear allegiance to the state and its laws and to use whatever means are sanctioned by that state to enforce its values. If they're willing to do that, they receive a uniform so that everybody knows they're acting as an agent of the state. They receive a paycheck and a pension and a box of daily weapons. It's a very, very simple concept, even though the job itself can sometimes be complicated. Without the threat or the use of violence, the state has no mechanism for maintaining the status hierarchies that we are told only exist in other countries. But what happens when the people, the source of legitimacy of the state, if you buy into Western theories of democracy, are at odds with the position of the state? Now we've got a really serious problem. And it's certainly one that the framers of state institutions thought about quite a bit. And they concluded, no big deal. What we'll do is we'll write down a few things that the state can't do. Okay, the state can't take away the right to speak out. The state can't take away the right to publicly put forth your grievances. The state can't take away your right to peacefully assemble for those purposes. Done. But the caveat is that the state gets to decide when those rights do and don't apply, in what context, for how long, in what ways, and for what purpose, how it must be done, and so forth. And furthermore, these rights, collectively mentioned in the First Amendment, confer no affirmative obligation on the state to support them. So when police show up to a protest, it's not to make sure the protesters are heard. It is to make sure that the system in which they live and work remains intact. So we're back to the original problem. What do we do when the people are at odds with the state? The answer is very simple: repression. But police repression isn't represented equally among all types of social and political movements. The most violent repression is reserved for movements that center racial justice, movements that question the fundamental role of whiteness and white supremacist hierarchies. Those are the ones that receive the harshest repression. We know from decades of research that police show up more often, escalate more quickly, and use more violent weapons to suppress racial justice movements than any other type of movement. Let me show you what this difference looks like. Do I have screen sharing ability? Okay. Hopefully, this slide can be seen. Yeah. So the data tell us that police are present at 57.3% of racial justice protests, compared to just 18.4% of non-racial justice protests. That's 3 times more likely to show up at a racial justice protest compared to any other type. And as we see over on the right side of my screen, the type of deployment varies by the type of protest. Riot police, state police, and the National Guard are present at 23.8% of racial justice protests, compared to just 3.1% of non-racial justice protests. That is the presence of the most repressive law enforcement types is 7.6 times more likely to be seen at racial justice protests compared to any other kind of protest. And yes, the data control for protester behaviors, crowd size, location, and the presence of counter demonstrations as well. So even contemporary mass movements like Occupy Wall Street, which has mobilized hundreds of thousands of protesters around the country, have faced nowhere near the violent repression that we see in movements for racial equality and autonomy, movements against police brutality and against racist genocides. Or, as a friend of mine said, well, instead of saying free Palestine, you should have just stood there and said, save the whales. They'd have let you stay for at least a couple of weeks. So, if you're familiar with the development of modern policing, none of this comes as a surprise, right? In modern policing, the focus was primarily on the protection of private property. Occasionally, police would be used to um, collect taxes, but for the most part, they had no central role in public life. That changed with the modernization of the institution itself, which came about as a direct means of control over enslaved persons. The slave patrolmen, who monitored every move and gesture, indeed every word Black folks uttered, transformed into organized militias whose oppressive tactics were deemed necessary to stabilize the slave economies of the South. But there was one problem. Open resistance to enslavement was growing. The number of revolts was increasing. And in many places, the number of enslaved persons outnumbered the enslavers. White folks were cooked. And so they said, we got to fix this. By the late 1600s, organized, vicious, oppressive, and inhumane patty rollers, as they were called, took the duty of keeping Black folks in their places, squashing potential rebellions, carrying arms to kill with impunity when they believed it necessary. Whatever it took to make the propertied white people make sure they could sleep at night without worrying too much about who opposed their power or who challenged their authority. And so it began the use of policing to control opposition, to intimidate people into submission, to make us think that our fate is whatever they say it is, armed with guns, whips, and binding ropes. The slave patrols, under full authority of the state, beat, maimed, and terrorized the Black community. They didn't usually kill them because in most of the territories, the state would actually have to compensate the slave owner for property loss if they killed them. The whips and the ropes have since been replaced with batons and handcuffs and zip ties, but the role remains the same. You show them who's boss. Shortly after the Civil War, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1871, and there's a section in it codified as 42 United States Code, Section 1983, that might strike some folks as a little bit odd when reading it. It says that every person acting under the color of state law, which just means in their official capacity as representatives of the state, who violates a person's civil rights can be sued in federal court. It's essentially a piece of legislation, federal legislation, that specifically holds state and local government actors accountable for violating people's rights in the name of the state. But why pass a federal law designed to bypass state courts and hold state public officials accountable in federal court? The answer lies in the history of policing. Okay, so pop quiz, what organization do we typically associate with lynchings? Usually it's the Klan, right? That we associate with that. Well, why in this particular law didn't Congress just target the Klan? They could have given calls of private action against those entities, but they didn't. Instead, they specifically mentioned state action. It doesn't make any sense at all unless you understand that it was the police who often initiated, led, and participated in the widespread lynchings. A Section 1983 lawsuit was one of the first ways of going after police who were systematically destroying Black communities by violently lynching people who dared not know their place. Some folks got really angry at us a few years ago during the protests when we chanted police and Klan go hand in hand. They said, no, 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 don't say that. The Klan, they're evil. They're vicious. They're atrocious. Why would you say that about police? And obviously, these were folks who didn't understand who Klan members actually were and what allowed them to operate for as long as they did. The ontology of whiteness requires white people, as represented by the state, to be able to predict and control. To the extent that they can predict and control other people's behavior, they feel safe. What we must understand then is that whiteness requires the presence of police. The very quality of life, indeed, their very existence, depends on it. There must be someone somewhere watching over the likely troublemakers, the ones who ask questions, the ones who resist, the ones who do not acknowledge the legitimacy of white supremacy and its objectives. It's the very basis of the law and order paradigm to enforce social and political stability, even when the lives of those at the bottom and those who are in the margins are anything but stable. So we must give the appearance of peace and prosperity for all the world to see. It has little to do with the actual social safety of people and everything to do with convincing those in power that there is no viable threat to their dominance, their control, or their financial assets. So please understand, this isn't about knowing a good cop who you may like very much, who may have gotten your cat down from a tree, or maybe who even raised you. This is about recognizing the ways in which the institution of policing serves the interests of those in power and protects them from any attempt to redistribute that power to those outside that class. The First Amendment asserts that there is a right to free speech, petition, and assembly. The government can't take away from the people, but it doesn't confer upon them an obligation to protect those rights. Regimes of discipline and control, that is the focus. Police violence is not only allowed, it is encouraged, it is legally legitimate, and it is monopolistic. Only the state are the legitimate purveyors of violence. It's tolerated by those who claim liberty as a core American value. Anyone who resists is automatically at fault. So does that mean that insiders aren't sometimes subject to state control too? Of course they are. But the difference is that they afford each other a level of grace that isn't afforded to anyone they have relegated to the margins. It's why Dylan Roof can walk into a Charleston, South Carolina church, murder 9 Black worshipers, and the cops take him to Burger King as he's being interrogated. But Eric Gardner choked to death for selling cigarettes and telling police he's tired of their harassment. So it's a whole systems problem where 3 things happen simultaneously. You've got the codification of laws that establish a racialized hierarchy of value. And then you got to have a coercive arm of the state to protect the white supremacist system you set up. Armed militias at all levels of governance. And finally, the punishments for those who step out of line must be very public and very humiliating because they are intended to send a message to everyone else. This is what happens when you challenge the order that we have put in place. Research continues to show that use of force is not about individual characteristics of police, whether they're good people, bad people, how well they're trained, etc. It has nothing to do with it. It's also not about the behavior of any perceived offender. Did they actually pose a threat? Did they comply? Were they respectful? The idea being, of course, that police have some innate right to justifiably sanction people they don't like or see as problematic. It is about the sanctioned use of force to uphold social and political norms. That is what any movement to end white supremacist policies, practices, and institutions is up against. And so we should ask, as we must with any institutional analysis, who benefits and at whose expense? So I'll end by saying solidarity with every single person who resists white supremacy in all of its forms, including the state-sanctioned genocide of the Palestinian people. It must be clear, it must be said often, and there must be direct action that challenges those norms. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Faulkner. That was both beautiful and powerful. So we really appreciate you sharing that. As we're sort of wrapping up, we have Dr. Jack left to speak and have he has some announcements from the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights.
Thank you, Shahad, and thank you all the organizers, students, faculty, and graduate students who spoke up today. This is deeply important, and I'm glad that we have it and are clarifying the record on what's been happening and why. Much like Dr. Faulkner, I also study the policing of social movements and the ways in which police repress political speech and dissent. I find it troubling, everything that we've heard today, and quite frankly, I don't think it's an exaggeration as somebody, as a scholar of this topic, to say that we are entering, if not have already entered, a new McCarthyite period in this country's history, unlike anything we've seen before, and taking lessons from the 1960s and 70s, as well as post-World War II eras of policing. The police are, and politicians in general, are very good at being flexible and adapt to situations. The upcoming repression that we're seeing and the repression that students have faced in April is an extension of these earlier movements and an evolution of them as well. New tactics are being introduced, new technologies to intervene in protest movements. And I think this is really important, but it can also be disempowering. It's difficult to go up and dissent against the state, and the state thrives when we are reticent to dissent, when we have fear, when we don't have the moral courage or clarity to stand up and call a genocide and to fight against it, to physically occupy space that university administrators don't want us to occupy, in defiance of norms that are allowing the genocide. However, hopelessness is not a luxury that we are allowed to afford, and so we wanted to end this town hall with a couple of small calls to action. These are going to be predominantly focused on upcoming legislation that's at the state level in Virginia. So if you're a resident of Virginia, this is going to encourage you to get involved. But really, I want to say that there's a much larger fight that needs to continue happening, a movement to join in and be a part of, and I highly recommend you reach out to folks so that we can plug you into this work if you haven't been involved already. Although looking at the roster of attendees, I suspect many of you have. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights legislative priorities for this upcoming session. We have historically, as an organization, been on the forefront of Palestinian rights, both by aggressively pursuing an expansion of Palestinian rights and recognition of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, but also a defensive role to block bills and legislation that has historically targeted Palestinian organizers. I got involved in the 2020-2021 legislative session when a legislator named John McGuire introduced a bill targeting the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement because I tried to enact BDS on my college campus at Virginia Tech. And have since then worked with them for 4 years to crush over a dozen pieces of legislation, each targeting a different topic. Most of the time, it's targeting divestment campaigns. The state seems to be deeply afraid of divestment campaigns as a useful tactic, but also targeting student protesters in a number of other ways. Last year, or actually, I think it might have been in the 2023 or 2024 session, the state passed and codified the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as guidance for the state of Virginia's hate crime codes. For those unfamiliar, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism declares any criticism of Israel, regardless of substance, regardless of intent, regardless of anything, to be in and of itself anti-Semitic. This would then make me, a Jewish activist, anti-Semitic for standing up here before you all today and criticizing Israel as a genocidal regime. While this is not necessarily legally binding, it has been weaponized by universities, police, and state legislatures to enact further retaliatory and repressive acts, both at the local level through policing policy, but also as the state level. Excuse me. And so I want to talk to you guys and give an overview about some of the legislation that's coming up in quite literally weeks from now. And then I would also like to add the link for Virginia Coalition for Human Rights Advocacy Day on January 23rd in Richmond. It's going to be all day, and there's also going to be other opportunities to plug in. So if you'd like to get involved, please sign up for that event to get more information and also just to get on our listservs. So in the chat, I'm about to put the 4 different policies that legislatures are trying to enact across 6 different bills. And I'll try to be brief about how I talk with them. So the first bill of concern is being introduced by Republican Jason Ballard. Ballard has made this one of his campaigning issues recently, playing into strongly racist tropes about terrorists on college campuses that has been discussed at length throughout this public forum. He has introduced House Bill 1650, titled the Virginia Anti-Terrorism Act, that would empower the Attorney General of Virginia, currently Jason Miyares, to be able to investigate nonprofit entities and other bodies without due process and without legitimate cause, as long as he has a, quote, reasonable suspicion that they might be engaging in terrorist activities. This is a broad overreach of power that, if afforded to the Attorney General, would effectively allow Republicans to investigate any organization they don't like, not just pro-Palestinian organizations, although certainly pro-Palestinian organizations are going to be the first up on the chopping block if this is passed, but any organization, including more moderate ones like the ACLU, who will be subject to the same sort of scrutiny because of political partisanship. The second bill that we are concerned about, it has both a House and Senate version. So the way that the Virginia legislature works is that the House and the Senate independently develop their own legislation, and then they meet in the middle, and this is going to happen sometime in early February this year, for what's called crossover, while they reconcile differences and bring it to the full Congress for a vote. So there's 2 bills right now up that do the same thing and that are basically identical to each other, one in the House and one in the Senate. These are HB 2186, introduced by Nicholas Freitas, a Republican, and then SB 1247, introduced by Tara Durant, also a Republican. These would basically target institutions of higher education, the universities whose students you've heard from throughout today, and force universities to sign effectively a loyalty pledge, saying that they have not provided grants, financial resources, scholarships, any sort of money for quote unquote terrorist organizations as defined by the Department of Homeland Security. Given the incoming federal administration and their willingness to leverage the label of terrorist and weaponize it against Palestinian activists, this would effectively be setting up to allow Trump to ban organizations like SJP, JVP, any sort of Muslim religious groups on college campuses receiving college funding, or allowing any students who participate in these from being part of higher education or seeking employment there. This is a broad overreach of power that is basically setting up to enable further repression down the line. The third policy that's being attempted to be enacted also has both a House and Senate component. The House bill is 2207, and that's introduced by Terry Kilgore. And the Senate version is SB 1284, introduced by William M. Stanley, both Republicans. And this does something similar. It basically prevents institutions of of higher education from offering material aid or support to terrorist activities, organizations, and et cetera. And the main difference between these 2 bills that I forgot to mention, apologies, these bills came out a few days ago, so I'm still getting up to speed and don't have the time to write out a full script, is that the first bill I was talking about that was addressing sort of terrorists in higher education is specifically about university partnerships with different governments designated as hosting terrorist organizations. So it would really try to block international students from Iran, from Egypt, from Lebanon. And then, so it takes more of a foreign policy approach. This bill, the HB 2207 and SB 1284, focuses more on student involvement on college campuses and would do more of that local work. These two bills work hand in hand to build the apparatus that is attempting to be built to enact further suppression and withholding of resources from Palestinian activists and their allies. The last bill is HB 2529. This one only has a House version. It is being introduced by Democrat Michael Jones. And what we've seen in the past is that a lot of these bills are attempting to be bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans both have a long history of trying to crack down on Palestinian activists, which is unsurprising. Most university college presidents are Democrats, and yet they've been at the forefront of a lot of the state repression of Palestinian activists. And this one, introduced by Michael Jones, is an attempt to block boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaigns on college campuses. It would prevent universities from divesting their endowments from any sort of cause. And unless that cause is invested in terrorist organizations, there's a fixation on terrorism across all four of these policies that are being attempted to be enacted. This is an evolving story. There might be more legislation that arises. Some of these might be withdrawn. But for the most part, we're looking at a fight in different committees, the Health and Education Committee in particular. I'm also going to include, if you're somebody who likes to write to your congressperson, the email addresses and membership of these committees. I've also included where in the committees these bills are in the chat. And I would encourage you to write and call your committee members to urge them to vote no against these bills. Thankfully, it seems as though the chairs of the Senate and House Health and Education Committees, which are Senator Ghazala Hashmi and Congress member Sam Razul, respectively, have historically voted against these sorts of bills and have a deeper understanding of this issue than many of their colleagues who have been very disappointing. So please write to them to encourage to continue to fight against these kinds of harmful pieces of legislation that are naked attempts to crack down on academic freedom and human rights. And again, if you're interested in joining the Virginia Coalition of Human Rights on January 23rd, or sort of in the next couple of weeks as we fight against these pieces of legislation in Virginia, once again, please use the Advocacy Day link. But as I wrap up here, the last things I wanted to say is first, if you have a question, please feel free to put that in the chat in the Q&A. And then the second thing is that the work can't stop here. This is just something that if you are a Virginia resident, that can be very helpful in terms of playing defense for student activists and academic freedom around college campuses. But the work simply can't stop here. Please join up with local organizations. Please get involved. We're going to face a new wave of retaliation, a new age of McCarthyism against social movements, and it's going to continue to get worse. But I hope that there are ways that you can find community to plug in, to find that moral clarity and bravery as our predecessors have done, as our heroes have done throughout the last 150, really 500 years. And to stand up for what's right and continue standing up for what's right. If you're here, that means you're on the right side of history, and that's often a very painful position to be in. But nonetheless, it is an important position to be in. And so please continue to fight, continue to stand up, and continue to move forward. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Shahed to moderate the questions. Thank you.
The little closing statement that I wanted to say is, first of all, thank you to all the powerful speakers that shared their testimonies today. And remember that we hope to continue holding the space for members from campuses to share their stories in their own narration. Today, we took back control of our narrative on what happened at our encampments and what has been happening on our campuses. And tomorrow, we will shift the media's propaganda and publish the truth. And that's something that the Palestinians have taught us. And soon, hopefully, we will watch as Palestine is freed. So now we will go into the Q&A session. Please ask your questions in the Q&A chat box. And we had anticipated to end the meeting at 1 p.m., but we will extend if necessary and if time allows. And remember, we're here to answer your questions. And I'll go ahead and start with the Q&A. So we had a question that said, for students, how has the university's repression impacted your academic and overall mental well-being? And is there anyone that would like to respond to that one? Sidian?
Yeah, I would say for me, in terms of academic well-being, thankfully, I will say one really important point is that the faculty have actually been beyond supportive. I've heard as well that's the case for many other colleges as well. But at least at VCU, our faculty has been beyond supportive. So in terms of academically, of course, it's been from a personal standpoint been a lot harder to try to complete my work. Again, like I think another big point that we miss is that while we try to advocate and spend our time as organizers, we also are full-time students. And so like with that in mind, and we also obviously care about our academics in order to continue to do good in the world, we want to be able to be, knowledgeable. But I will say that the faculty has been very, very helpful. They've been very accommodating, and I would actually honestly, I don't know if there's any other students here as well who are also struggling with deadlines and things like that. But I will say, even if you're not necessarily like a core organizer, even if you're not specifically connected to the issue, that doesn't mean you can't email your professors and say that you are, not mentally having there's no light way to phrase it without saying, you mentally have not been well, because I just honestly acknowledge that this is not a normal thing that has become like, quote unquote normalized, is just actively watching a genocide happen on our phones. And so I guess for some reason that turned into me giving advice somehow. But I guess what I was trying to say is that if you are as well struggling, or anybody in this meeting, or if you know anyone, I would definitely reach out to professors, because they're a lot more accommodating than you think. Is additionally like what I've heard, what I've experienced, and also as well what I've heard. So I will say academically, it's been very tough for me, but thankfully I've been able to push through with support of friends, and also support of the faculty as well. And I will say emotionally, obviously, it's been really there's no words to describe, I think, how painful this has been. But I will say that organizing and having these protests in some sort of way actually makes the mental toll a lot less, because you at least have a space where you're looking around and you see all these people who are fighting for the same exact thing that you're fighting for, and it makes you feel a lot less alone. And so it's I always talk about this, but I think that um, the word resistance sometimes to outsiders continuously gets misconstrued for some reason. But I will say that for me, the biggest form of resistance, in my opinion, is simply just existing. And so I think that existence is resistance. And so in that sort of sense, I think mentally it's been easier in that sort of sense, as seeing especially these people in the meeting as well. Thank you, Shahad, for organizing this. So hearing all these perspectives really makes you feel like you're not going crazy in a system and underneath an institution that makes you feel like you're in the wrong. Yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, Celine answered it really beautifully. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's really about just you doing your part of extending your hand and like asking for help. Which I mean, obviously a lot of people sometimes struggle with that, but the help is there when you ask for it. In terms of the university's like repression that comes from administration, in the beginning, it was really degrading, I would say, in a sense, because I mean, we all were struck with like, oh, there's a genocide going on, and especially as like a Palestinian, it was. I mean, we knew the events that have been going on in Palestine, but like witnessing and being able to see it consistently coming out in the media and seeing that escalation in the genocide in Gaza obviously took a huge toll on a lot of people, especially the Palestinians on campus. And then when we would, go to administrations for help, like dean of students, like for example at Virginia Tech, like Mark Sykes, or we would talk to Sim Sands, like the only thing they would ever say is, we have resources, but they would never actually provide those resources. They would never actually help us out. And we were met, I mean, oftentimes with like rejection, like they really have no interest in helping you out. But I mean, as Sidine said, really, it is the movement and the people that are around you. I mean, seeing how Virginia Tech's community came together and we've built such a diverse and inclusive environment that is supportive, and that truly has your back no matter what. You feel that sense of safety because you know that there's always a target on your back, but you have that community helping you. You have that community that will stand up for you for instance, that anything were to happen. So I know that that's what I mean gives me courage. That's what gives, others courage to continuously stand up and fight against this level of repression and yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say. I mean, if anyone else would like to say something from the other speakers, please, by all means, before we move on to the next question. Liam, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to add something. So I run a organization on my campus, that's a mental health organization. And I think something that cannot be touched on enough is how impactful, like having or going to a university that's supposed to care about your future, supposed to care, or claims to care about your mental health, claims to care about your well-being, how harmful it is to be in that environment where you're promised these things, and then at the same time, you have the same institution not only recognizing like mental health or success through one very like narrow lens. So they don't understand the context of or in the importance of like supporting people's identities in a full lens, because if they did, they wouldn't support a genocide. And I think you know, a lot of my friends and a lot of people that have come to the club and like had conversations with me about their personal experiences with what's going on. It takes a huge toll, such a detrimental toll on people's lives where not only for many people on our campuses are their relatives literally being murdered, but also they are trying to go to university to build a better life for themselves. Um, and then they're also being denied even the recognition of their loved ones from receiving their love. Recognition itself and is in a way of love, remembering, appreciating. But if that's not there, if we're not able to do that, then I feel like the some of the most simple aspects of the human experience itself is being stripped from the students on these campuses. So I think like and this is a lot of experiences I've heard from a lot of different students on our campus, but I think that point really cannot be underplayed. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Liam. Is there anyone else that would like to share? Okay, we can move on to the next question. So, Bisan Auda, Palestinian journalist, said, "We were so happy and hopeful when the student revolution started and so disappointed when it fizzled out." The question is, students, what would you say to her if she could hear you? Vivian?
I would I think that's actually a tough question, but I would say that if she could hear us, I think something that we would acknowledge is that it's okay as well to acknowledge that that's not really a secret that the student movement, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's fizzled out. But I will say that it has had a sort of decline in momentum, and many people have observed this as well. And I think that I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a negative thing. I think it's something that I would say to her, but also to anyone as well, thinking that as well, because I've heard that, like, like it's, when's the next big protest happening? When is this? Is there going to be another sort of encampment, something like that? And I think that something that's important to acknowledge is that we hear the word capacity a lot, and I think that we need to understand that a movement, and in a movement, you can't consistently always be, making action, 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 action. And so I think that there's this kind of idea that the student movement fizzled out, but when in reality, yes, it has maybe lost a little bit of momentum. Because unfortunately, a lot of people join movements and then leave because they find it to be like, for lack of better words, trendy. But something that I will acknowledge is that in a movement, just because action isn't happening doesn't mean that things aren't happening. Organizers, on top of also organizing protests and doing things that the public can see, we have to also take into account the things that people do behind the scenes. Because in a movement, you don't just need action, you also need strategy. And strategy is a huge part of the movement. And so I will say that I think we need to, I guess, like hold space for that as well, and understanding that, like, where we would never leave the people of Palestine or Gaza or any of those who are struggling. And so I think that taking into account that people as well are strategizing for the better, and strategizing so that way we can come back stronger and joint together. Because honestly, in my eyes, I've actually seen that maybe we haven't had as many direct actions. But what I will say is that I think I've watched coalitions actually get much stronger. I've watched, for example, talking about Virginia SJPs, we've recently all been able to come together and have like a group chat and have a big event that we're organizing right now. So I think strategy is a big part. And just because you have a kind of mellow section of the movement doesn't mean that the movement has completely declined. That's what I'd say.
Anyone else that would like to answer before I give my opinions? Okay, I mean, Celine again covered a majority like part of it too, and I would say at least like at Virginia Tech, what we try to do is like we do have our like Fridays for Palestine. We try to do protests every Friday, and we know that even if I mean this protest isn't doing much on this campus, we know that Palestinians like we hope to for it to reach like Palestinians in Gaza right now because we've heard that it does give them hope. It does, give them something to look forward to. And so, I mean, even like just for that reason, we know that we consistently continue to like do our protests for that to be able to give them, that hope. But I mean, as Sadine was saying, like even at Virginia Tech and what we've been seeing around, the nation is, I mean, SJP took the time to like organize and mobilize this semester at least. That's what we've been focusing on. And that, you know, this necessary step and action that we need to take right now in getting as like much numbers as we can, educating as many people as we can, having people form coalitions and join movements and all of that. Like that is all necessary steps that kind of happen behind the scenes because obviously these aren't the things that are being published or, recorded at all times and all of that. But these are things that are happening and are consistently happening. And I mean, that's something that I would say to her is that no one has forgotten about Palestine and we're here to make sure that no one forgets about Palestine until Palestine is free. And even, after that, obviously this is gonna go down in history. And we'll be the educators, we'll be the ones like sharing the real stories and real testimonies when, institutions want to come and say, oh, we did have these protesters, we did help when we know that, what exactly happened to us and how they tried to silence and repress us. And so that would be my answer is that, again, like no one forgot about Palestine. We're all really working in organizing for, you know, potential direct actions that we're going to be taking. So yeah, that would be it. Does anyone else want to take on this question before we move on? Okay, so we have two more questions to discuss. So Dr. Gill said, thank you all for speaking so forcefully and with so much courage and clarity. Fighting back against this repression is a key part of the struggle against the genocide as we fight for our own right to organize and speak out against the genocide. We continue to center Gaza and the imperative of ending genocide. My question is, what is your assessment of where the Palestine Solidarity Movement is today and where you see it going this semester and beyond? What are the challenges and opportunities that we face? So I can start with answering this question because I mean, it's very similar to how I answered the previous one. And the way I see it is, again, Palestine Solidarity Movement right now is really focusing on organizing, and that's based on experience and what I see on campus and in Virginia, of how much we have been focusing on organizing and mobilizing our organizations together, not just on one campus, but really, as Savine was saying, forming that coalition between the campuses in Virginia and really seeing how we could not just target our administrators and put pressures on them, but also on the state level. So this is really where I'd say we are right now. And in terms of the semester, I believe we've done good good mobilizing on this, like on our campus, at least at Virginia Tech. And we hope to just start the planning process of seeing what we could do with that mass organizing. Challenges and opportunities that we face, I mean, they're endless. I mean, the repression that we've just shared in the silencing of our voices, and how administrators are targeting students, and not just students but faculty and staff, and how the state is also targeting these people, and basically it's really anyone that just opens their mouth against injustice, and anyone that opens their mouth to speak up for Palestine. And so that's really something that I know we're all combating and we're all fighting against, and we all experience. But you know, that's something that we'd never stop. Like that's not something that we see as a threat. And again, as I said, we know that this movement is so big and has become so vast that, you know, people will be protected and will protect each other. So like we don't need police for that. We don't need administrators for that. It's really just going to be the people united. So since I'm answering your question, Dr. Gill, people united will never be defeated. Celine, go ahead.
Yeah, I would also, again, Shad, you touched on most of the points I was going to say, but I would also say, like I said, it's okay to as well acknowledge that, Dr. Gill had even mentioned this in your question, that, the Palestinian movement, I think today does stand at some sort of critical crossroad because it is marked by, immense challenges, but as well as also marked by significant opportunities. I think that the resilience of Palestinians, in Gaza is continuously what drives people to continue. And I think, it is amplified by our global solidarity, and it has brought our struggle for justice into kind of this sharper focus. And I will say, though, however, of course, we are going to face repression, whether it's from being students advocating, whether it's just community members advocating, whatever it may be, but particularly in academic spaces, like we just talked about in the meeting, where students and activists particularly are being targeted for speaking out. But I think that obviously we have to acknowledge that the reason that we're being so targeted is because we are completely against what the university is funding. And the university, of course, is going to try to quiet down people that just, do dare to dissent and to speak the truth, and to, bring to light really what they are funding. I mean, for example, VCU is a public university. We should have access to their finances and where our tuition goes towards. And that yet, for some reason, when you access the VCU website, there's a good chunk of the pie chart that's just labeled as other. And we have continued to demand that they divest and talk to multiple people and gone through like loopholes and everything like that. And yet they refuse to divest, but try to deny having any sort of ties. And so when we tell them, if you don't have ties, just divest, they go silent. So I think the universities are increasingly, especially as of now, in terms of your question about where are we right now, I think that students are very much focused on pressuring the university to divest from complicity and to protect the right of free expression. I think that those efforts are often met with resistance and censorship and punitive measures. I've gotten a couple policy violations for very simple things. And I think with that in mind, I think divesting and pressuring the university to divest is something that is ultimately long term, and it's not going to happen quick. But it is something that would make a massive change. And so I think that despite the challenges that we do face, I think there are obviously always growing opportunities to build momentum on, and whether it's the rise of digital advocacy, international solidarity networks, grassroots organizing, they all kind of offer these new platforms to amplify our voices and to push for real tangible change. So as we continue to pressure institutions, organizations, kind of combat this repression, as we're doing right now, focusing on reclaiming our narrative, and the movement will, in fact, because of all this, continue to persist and evolving and strengthening until justice, freedom, and equality are secured for all Palestinians.
Oh, wonderfully said. Liam, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was just going to speak on, I think we can look just like within the Zoom call of how the movement is going. I mean, you had wonderful speakers all throughout today, very like eloquently spoken. There is every time I come back to one of these things, I think I see how much more practice everyone has had in communicating their experiences, their thoughts. And on top of that, you have like over 50 people um, participating in this for 2 hours. You ask anyone to stay on Zoom for 2 hours in any other context, you pretty much never get that. So I think we also have to ask ourselves of like, or not ask ourselves, but rather reflect of like, this movement, everyone involved in this call today is a part of this movement. And I think like part of what you can do is when trying to answer this question of like how is this movement going? How did this go? What did you learn? Did you learn more? Um, were you able to reflect on different things and different perspectives? I think this is a testament in and of itself of where this movement is. And I think there's like two different ways we can look at progress. We can look at progress in the sense of like the laws that are being passed or maybe the institutional changes that we're making. Or we can also look at progress in the sense of what are people feeling? What are communities feeling? What is society feeling? Is there a change that we are starting to see in which people are giving attention to issues like this? I think that if we measure in the one lens of um, is there legal changes? Is there structural changes? There's not. And that is very unfortunate. But I think also structural changes come from the societal changes themselves, because there has to be the societal conditions for there to be structural change. And I think that's really what this is part of, is building the societal changes, creating spaces where people can be heard, where we don't have to go to a committee meeting and basically yell to have our voices heard because other people are yelling as well right back at us. Um, and I think there's a lot of really concentration on how the message is being spread. And I think this venue in specific was a great way of being able to focus on the words and experiences instead of focusing on like just trying to be heard in general. So I think uh, to wrap everything up, I'm saying I think it is going very well because you see a lot more strategery in the way things are planned. You see a lot more experience at every single time one of these things happen with the speakers and being able to articulate their thoughts. And then you also see a greater amount of participation. And I think that itself, it gives me a lot of hope personally. And I know that, for me, having a community like this where I'm able to communicate my thoughts and be heard in this space is very important. I think that shows the strength of a movement like this.
Thank you, Liam. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Is there anyone else that would like to answer? Okay, we can go ahead and move on to the last question. So Rose Esper said, excellent speakers and presentations. So sorry for your university's violence against you, but appreciate your steadfastness. Please let our various organizations know when and how we can best support you in your ongoing advocacy. And Rose is part of the VCHR, which is the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights. I mean, on our behalf, I would say we would need your help in terms of like the bills that, for example, Dr. Luff was just mentioning, like that's something that we know that it's something that we need to target, but we need your help in helping us and and we want to help you also like target them in terms of, it coming from students and constituents. So I think that's really something that we should, connect on and work on in order to, to have this victory of, combating those bills. But that's really something that I would say. Okay. If um if there are no more questions, thank you to every speaker that came and shared their stories and their testimonies. As Liam was saying, this was really to create a space where we feel safe just talking freely and to basically talk comfortably and not feel the need to scream and shout because we're also being targeted. And hopefully we got our voices heard, and we're going to be posting this so that we can have it saved in the archives. But we really hope to continuously have these town halls where different speakers can come and speak on their stories and their own testimonies and really hold that safe space for people that are part of this Palestine movement and create that, supportive system for them. And yeah, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all panelists and people that came and watched and supported and stayed for 2 hours. And we really appreciate every single one of you. And yeah, together we will win and we'll free Palestine, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for organizing this. Thank you.
Of course, yeah, thank you.